Okay. Okay. Speaking about the design of the living shoreline and oyster reef at Ambrosini Field. So I'm going to dive into the process of what was involved in getting to where we are now. But I just want to catch everybody up on where we are now before I dive into that. I would say, are at the point where we have a advanced draft design, and it has been submitted for review to Parks, the New York City Department of Parks. And then it will go on to the next phase of review and permitting. So because it is city property owned by the Department of Parks and Recreation, we are under jurisdiction of both federal, state, and city. So there's quite a long review and permitting process involved in this design. Because we are still involved in that process, everything that I present to you is subject to change depending upon the comments that we get back from the various agencies. But I think we're pretty confident we've brought the design to a place where I think it'll get through the permit process fairly smoothly. So let's go into it. When I was brought on board this project back in early summer of last year, the City Island Oyster Reef Board came to me with, I think, a pretty well-formed wish list of what they wanted to see on the site. And so through the process of bouncing ideas back and forth with the board, as well as with the Department of Parks and other experts who've been brought on board to consult on the project, we've narrowed down that big wish list a bit based upon the scope, the feasibility, and then what the willingness of the property owner was to allow at this phase, what they wanted to see on the site. But the overarching desire is to meet the organization's mission. And this is my language, sort of summarizing what that mission is. In the long term, this is a pilot project, and we hope in the future City Island can bring many more restored reefs across City Island. And Ambrosini Field was selected as a pilot site for that. And there's various reasons why Ambrosini Field was selected. And that's what I want to talk about first. I do recognize that probably the majority of the people on this meeting know the site very well, but for the benefit of for those who are not so familiar with it, I'll go briefly over what the site looks like now. So this is a Google aerial of the site, so I can talk about it. So you can see this is a project location relative to City Island. If you're following my little red cursor on the screen, it's located on the southeast shore of the island. It's a fairly large lot, and what you see in the aerial is just the sort of shoreline portion of the property. It is a park owned by the Department of Parks, New York City Department of Parks. Most of the property is occupied by playground, baseball fields, as you can see. Here's one of the larger ones here. There's also a public school, elementary school located adjacent to the public park, PS 175. And so the park is very active and well used. But what we're interested in is the portion of the property that is along the shoreline. So if you're following my cursor, there's a fence that goes along like that. So everything between the fence and the water is the part of the property that we're focusing on for this project. It's about 1.5 acres of land. That does not include underwater parts that are being included in the project design. And just to point out some of the characteristics, and I'll refer to the site, I've referred to it basically as 3 peninsulas, the north, the middle, the south, dividing 2 embayments, so the northern embayment here and southern embayment here. You can see these 2 embayments are very different from each other. In the early 90s, Army Corps of Engineers put riprap to stabilize the shoreline here. So you can see the whole shoreline is reinforced with riprap. And it kind of disappears here. It's hidden behind some vegetation, but it goes down all the way. In the southern embayment, just behind that riprap, it is still a tidal area. And because of the breakwater protection provided by the riprap, a really nice salt marsh has established here, which is a great asset to have on the site. Up here in this northern embayment, everything tidal is on this side of the riprap. So we don't have much marsh established here, although right here, there is a tiny patch of low salt marsh that has managed to gain a foothold and managed to be fairly stable over the years, it appears. So that is great. I'm going to talk about specifics. So site assets. The big one that I talked about is this very beautiful salt marsh that's growing behind the riprap. You can see this is all low marsh Spartina grass that's growing here. There's a host to a really pretty healthy population of red mussels and fiddler crabs, which is great. You'll know that in a nice healthy marsh, red mussels and Spartina grass grow in assimilation with each other. The red mussels, they help anchor the roots of the Spartina. You can see that happening here. This is a picture from the site. The red mussels here growing at the base of the Spartina grass. So that's really great to see. There is a small population of eastern oysters that's growing attached to the riprap. It's small and it's a bit spotty. Not enough to sustain a reef on its own, but it's great to see them there. It means that the population of oysters, that the conditions are appropriate for oysters to grow. They just maybe need a little help to get to a bigger, more robust state. And the other great asset about this site is that it is a very popular park, especially in the summertime when you have Little League and the school is open. So it's very popular with the community. It's close to the school. So Sally talked about the desire to bring to this site an established education program. So that the proximity to the school and the teachers is a great asset. And then it's very close to a residential community. So it serves that population really well. And I would say it's very beautiful views of Long Island Sound, which is not too bad. The challenge of the site, though, so there is quite, especially in the upland area, a very dense growth of invasive plant species. In this upper photo, you can see, and this is from early last summer. So the board members and volunteers have actually attacked this patch pretty aggressively since then, but it gives you a sense of what they're dealing with. This is Japanese knotweed and other various weeds growing in. If you know Japanese knotweed, you know it's very aggressive and it's quite difficult to get rid of. So this is multiple years of management ahead for the group and for volunteers in order to get rid of this. there's, and this is true for the whole city, rising waters, increased storm surge that threaten the unprotected portions of the shoreline. So I mentioned this little patch of marsh grass here. You can see how small it is relative to the size of this beach area in the northern embayment. It appears fairly stable in that it hasn't noticeably decreased over the years. If you look at aerial photos of the site, it seems to be about the same size, but it hasn't grown at all beyond this little patch in recent years. It also, we know that the storms are going to get worse and the sea level is going to rise. So it's definitely in a very vulnerable position. If it was on the other side of the riprap, it would have some protection, but right now it has very little protection from the waves. And I mentioned this already, the low oyster density, though it's great to see the oysters on site, it's really insufficient to provide the larvae for a reef. So what that means is having substrate is not enough to establish a reef population, oyster reef. And then just from a user standpoint, there's really no gathering area or seeding area on the site. There's very little in terms of a pathway system either. So if you enter the shoreline area from the park, there's really nowhere to circulate, no defined space to circulate. So those are the challenges that we were trying to tackle.
What they plan on doing around the thing.
So these are, I kind of categorize the project goals into 3 groups. The living elements, which are, sorry, there's a typo there. We want to manage those invasive weeds and vegetation, which is the Japanese knotweed in the upper zone. And then at the northern fringe of the low marsh, or the high marsh, excuse me, there's some Phragmites growing, and I'll show you a picture in just a bit of what that looks like. So that's another aggressive invasive vegetation that will need some special management. We want to expand and enhance the biological communities. So we have a little patch of marsh in the upper embayment. We want to expand that. We want to add an oyster reef, and that's a big part of the project. And then we generally want to enhance the aesthetic appeal of the shoreline with the plants and with a circulation system. To achieve that, we're going to need some what I would call porous structures. So we're designing a living shoreline. That means we're not going to go in with some big stones and boulders, anything harsh that would just block water, block fauna from moving through. We're doing the lightest touch we can, but something that is still substantial enough to withstand the waves and offer protection from the increasing storm surges. So I'll show you again in just a bit what that means, what products we're going to be using. But doing this will also allow us to introduce the oyster reef and allow us to protect the marsh vegetation. And then the human engagement part of it is improving the entrance to the shoreline area, adding an area for gathering and an area for seeding. So those are the big goals. And then what this looks like in plan. So this is a concept plan of what is proposed to the site. I flipped the image. So if comparing it to the aerial, you can flip it 90 degrees. So the water now is up here, but this is actually to the east, what is looking up. So I'll just walk you through the site. This is the main gate coming in from the park area. So over here is the ball field, the baseball diamond here, and you'd walk through. This is the main gate. It's already an existing gate. And we brought in a short pathway leading to a circular sitting area here that sits at the high point of this center peninsula. And sitting here, it gives you really great views of the water, great views of the marsh. It's also, I think, a really nice invitation to the site. If you're standing here, it gives you a nice visual, it makes it visually desirable to want to walk out there when you see this. So it's a short circulation system. This is, you can consider it sort of a phase 1 in terms of design. We did early on propose a full circulation system across the entire upland portion of the site. Parks Department wasn't quite ready for us to do such a full circulation system. So we're proposing this as a phase 1. It's a short, little modest hint of what the site offers. And in future years, there may be potential to expand the circulation system across the whole upper portion of the site. And then what we have here in the northern embayment is sort of, I guess, the real biggest change to the site. And out here, we have the introduction of an oyster reef. So we're using a couple products as substrate for oyster reef, and I have pictures coming up in just a moment. We're using a product called oyster castles, which are cement-like blocks that kind of stack together like a Lego. And they offer a substrate for which the oysters can grow on. The plan is to, excuse me, to seed the oyster blocks with oyster spat to give this a head start and hopefully offer potential for really robust growth of a reef. We also wanted to complement that, the oyster castles, with some oyster reef balls, which is the two circular objects that are part of this reef. And I'll speak in a moment about why we included those two. And then up here, we wanted to include something that would offer more robust protection to the existing marsh vegetation that's here. Excuse me. So we, again, are using the oyster castles to build a wave attenuation structure, something that will not block, but slow down the waves when we have a storm surge or an aggressive high tide coming in, and really offer protection. I'm getting a little, hopefully I won't lose my voice, but I'll keep going. And also, we hope allow protection to expand the marsh. So the plan here is to add additional marsh grass next to the existing marsh grass, and in so doing, actually double the size of the marsh growing in this northern embayment. Here in the southern embayment, we are including a couple what are called community oyster reefs. And you may be familiar with this. These are products from the Billion Oyster Project. They're the cages with pull-out slides that contain the oysters, essentially. We separated them from the main oyster reef because they're serving a bit of a different function here. Whereas this oyster reef is fixed in place, and to see it, you have to physically go out into the water to see them. But with the oyster cages, you actually can retrieve the oysters and bring them to shore, or bring them to wherever. You can bring them up here to the gathering area, for instance, and actually show students. So they're a different way of seeing the oysters. But unfortunately, this area is a little bit harder to get down to. I apologize. So I think this is better suited for, say, an individual, a teacher, or one volunteer to go down, retrieve the oysters and bring it back up to the site for viewing. This is a fairly, well, relatively easier area to access. So it's much more feasible to bring a small group out here to actually see the oysters. In theory, you could do the same here, but we want to limit the amount of people coming into this area because we want to be mindful that we don't want a lot of people trampling through the salt marsh that's already here, established here. So they're serving the same basic function of establishing an oyster reef, but they're doing it in different ways and allowing the community to see it in different ways. Then up here, this is the established oyster or established marsh with the mussels growing in it that I showed you before. Very little is going to be done to the marsh other than to continue to observe it, monitor for any changes in the long term. However, at the upper fringe of the marsh is where we have some Phragmites starting to encroach. So the proposal going forward is to deal with the Phragmites in a strategic way of partnering it with replanting. We don't want to just tear out the Phragmites for various reasons. One, because it does offer some ecological benefit, less compared to the Spartina grass. There's a lot of research that has been done comparing them. However, it does offer some. So we don't want to just rip it out and leave a hole. We also don't want to rip it out because we don't want to loosen the soil and leave it vulnerable to erosion. So the proposal is to incrementally over time remove parts, remove areas of Phragmites, and in the process go back and replant it with more desirable vegetation. That is upper high marsh grass or salt shrub vegetation. And so it's a sort of a two-pronged approach to dealing with this zone, which is Phragmites removal paired with replanting. And then in the upper zone, all over, because we have a lot of the Japanese knotweed growing in, a lot of mugwort, various other vines growing along the fence line, stuff for the large part that is not particularly desirable. And the group has already begun doing a lot of weed removal. They've actually done an impressive amount already, which Sally talked about in our introduction. The proposal is to remove that and replace it with an upland meadow vegetation using a combination of live planting, transplants, and the spreading of seeds across the site. The goal being to get a really dense planting. So there's some hope that by being aggressive with the planting, we can get a head start on sort of get ahead of the Japanese knotweed returning after it's been removed, although it is very difficult to deal with. So it's going to be a difficult challenge. I'm going to talk a little quicker through some of these. But I wanted to show you some images to break down what I already talked about in a little more specific way. So I already showed you this image on the right, the Japanese knotweed growing in the upper part of the zone. And the plan, of course, is to get rid of this Japanese knotweed and all the other weeds and replace it with an upland meadow. This is the sort of upper part of the marsh in the southern embayment. And you can see the low sort of soft grass is Spartina patens, which is the salt marsh grass you typically see dominating the upper marsh zone. And then the taller grass sticking up are young Phragmites. This is early in the summer, so it hasn't quite grown to full size yet in this photo. You're also seeing some shrubs sticking up here around. There's some desirable Baccharis, Iva shrubs growing in the site. So there's a lot of really good vegetation in this area, but you can see the Phragmites is kind of making its way into this zone. So this is the area where we're very strategically going to go in, remove Phragmites, hand weeding it, and then in areas where we have large openings, going in and replanting with some more desirable vegetation. So if I can show you sort of conceptually what this looks like in section, you have the low salt marsh zone, which is dominated by Spartina alterniflora, which is that taller Spartina grass that I showed you in a very early slide. And that zone is inundated by a daily tidal waters. So it sustains, it's basically standing in water for 2 times a day. And then just above that, just a little bit higher, we have the high salt marsh. On this site, and as a typical in this part of the country, the high salt marsh is dominated by Spartina patens. So low marsh is Spartina alterniflora, high marsh Spartina patens. And it doesn't get inundated daily, but it does get sort of the high tides coming in, moon tides come in. So occasional inundation in this zone. Just above that, you have what might be called the salt shrub zone. Again, dominated by shrubs like Iva, Baccharis. These are common. You also see a lot of seaside goldenrod growing in this area. It doesn't typically get any tide surges or any water coming in, but it'll get, has the ground will absorb some water. So it's generally moist water in this area. It gets some water spray coming in. So the shrubs and vegetation in this area are salt tolerant. They're tolerant of high moisture in the soil, but they don't do well with standing water so much. And then above that, the upland zone, which is generally free of any sort of tidal activity. And this is what the site looks like now, essentially. We have some really nice Spartina alterniflora, nice Spartina patens, and some nice shrubs, but the Phragmites have started to really encroach in the upper part of the high salt marsh, sort of into the salt shrub zone. And then the upland, it's pretty much all dominated by Japanese knotweed and other weeds. Not entirely weedy in the upland, but it's the dominant vegetation. So this is what we want to see. We want to remove that Phragmites that's creeping into this zone and beef it up with some more shrubs, some more Spartina patens. In the upland meadow, we want to get rid of all that Japanese knotweed, all that mugwort, etc., and replace it with a really nice grass-dominated meadow. Just some images of what the vegetation would look like below. And then this is the little patch in the southern embayment, the little patch of low marsh here. It's hanging on. So the plan is to plant more high marsh, sort of just in this zone over here where my cursor is. And as I said, we're basically planting the same size that we see here. We're going to double the size in this zone, so double the size of the marsh in this area. But to do so, we need to provide some protection. And we're going to provide that protection with a wave attenuation structure constructed from stacked oyster castles. And this is what the oyster castles look like if you're not familiar with the product. They're basically little blocks, 1 foot by 1 foot, about 8 inches tall. They're a concrete structure. The concrete is designed, it was developed to be conducive to oysters and other sea life to grow on. You can see they're quite easy. Each one weighs between 25, 30 pounds. So fairly easy for a group of volunteers to move them into site and stack them up. So that makes them really great for a kind of do-it-yourself project, and really great community involvement project. And over time, eventually, as they are kind of sitting out there, they do get crusted over with vegetation. There's a very good chance if you put them out there sort of in their raw state, they would eventually, some wildlife, some fauna would eventually find their way just naturally, but we want to give them a head start. So the hope is that we will sort of seed the oyster castle blocks in a vat with some oyster spat to give them a good head start. So we'll get really crusted over. Now there's some shortcomings to the oyster castles because they're stacked together. In a very extreme wave come along, a very strong wave, they do have the potential to get lifted up and topple over. In that event, usually you can just go out and they'll usually just kind of topple over, you can stack them back up. But we want to use this as an opportunity to test some other things side by side. We want to bring in a pair of what are called oyster reef balls. This is about an 18-inch high, again, a cement structure. So they're very similar sort of in their chemical makeup. But obviously the oyster reef ball is a solid structure. It's not composed of individual pieces, although it has a lot of porous holes in it. So in the same way that the oyster castle blocks will get encrusted with oysters and other fauna and bivalves, so will the oyster reef balls. But offers the advantage of not being so susceptible to strong waves and toppling over. The disadvantage of the oyster reef ball is that because it is a single unit, they're a bit more difficult to move around. So for that reason, we're just including a couple of them just as an experiment to see in comparison to the oyster castles, how they kind of hold up to the waves and how they do in providing a substrate for the oysters to grow on. And then we wanted to include, for the reasons I mentioned before, we wanted to include a couple of the Billion Oyster Project community oyster reef cages. As you can see, these little file cabinets kind of come out and they can be lifted up. They can be brought ashore, brought to a school group or a research group, whoever's visiting the site. So if you're doing this with a large group, rather than having them all kind of go out into the mudflat and look at the oyster castles and the oyster reef balls, the Billion Oyster Project cages have the advantage of being able to be brought to the group. So it's kind of a nice complement to the more fixed in place structure. We're also using this as a way to attenuate the waves and slow down that wave energy, and hopefully allow us to get that additional salt marsh established and protect the existing salt marsh from what we anticipate will be future stronger waves, higher tides. And this is sort of an image of what it would look like altogether. So just comparison. This is what we have now, and this is proposed. So you can see out in the water, it would actually be for the most part underwater. The oyster reef here, so the stacked oyster castles and a couple reef balls forming the oyster reef out here in the water. And then a little higher up in front of the salt marsh, stack of the oyster castles being used as a wave attenuation. And the way it's stacked is not intended to stop the water, it's intended to allow free flow of water through, but just to sort of slow it down. And it really does, when you see it in action, it slows it down from a very visible high energy wave to sort of a nice gentle ripple on the landward side of the structure. Our little existing marsh, again, gets doubled in size. So we're doubling the size of the marsh in this area, and then adding a whole upland meadow to the shoreline, or above the shoreline in the upland zone. So that's what that would look like, that area would look like, to give you an idea of what's coming. And then I did mention the sort of path seating area coming from the entrance, and the seating area would be nestled into a little stand of some existing honey locust trees that are growing here on the high part of that center peninsula. So it's a really nice sitting area. You can see views all around of Long Island Sound. I think this is going to be a really nice, pleasant place to sit, either as an individual who just wants to come out and just enjoy the view, or a small classroom group to just sit and talk about what they see, talk about the reef and the marsh grass and the meadows up above. And I think this is, though a modest path and seating area to start, I think it's a much improved scenario than what is there now. Currently, there being no circulation system and no real sitting area for a group. So, and then I managed to stop just about 9 o'clock, which I wanted to do because I wanted to, I anticipate there might be some questions. Hopefully I didn't go through that too quickly, or too, I didn't skirt over too many details. I just wanted to say thank you and ask if there was any questions. I'm very happy to answer questions.
Well, I'll start away. First, Filomena, it was wonderful, and it's so exciting to see the visuals of what the living shoreline will eventually look like. I had a question. There's often talk I've read about the important role marshlands play in terms of capturing carbon. Can you explain what that is? And in our tiny little marshland, do you think a difference will be made?
So I'll answer the second part first. There's been a lot of research done looking at the impact of the scale of marsh restorations. And luckily, even a small scale restoration has noticeable impact, noticeable biological, ecological impact. So you probably will see something. The scale is relative to the scale of the restoration, but I think this will make some noticeable improvements to the site for sure. In terms of the carbon, I'm certainly not an expert in carbon sequestration, but I can tell you, compared to, say, a forest or an upland forest or even the meadow, marshes are much better at carbon sequestration than even forests are. So protecting these marshes and expanding them and restoring them is really essential for carbon sequestration on a global scale, because we're losing our marshes pretty rapidly. And you can see a lot of it, a lot of the reason why you can see at this site, because the upland is so developed. As you have tides moving in, if this is a pre-developed site, the marsh would simply move with the water, it would move further in. But because it's developed, it's a city, there really isn't a lot of space for the marsh to move. So eventually what's happening now and what is going to continue to happen is you're going to see the tides creeping up higher and higher, the water levels creeping up higher and higher, and eventually the marsh is not having any space to creep up with the water. So every potential we have to protect and restore our marshes are really critical, and carbon is a big part of that, and big part of the reason why we want to do that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Filomena. It was a great presentation. And again, it was so good to see the visual. It's exciting because it really is coming to life, and keep our fingers crossed that all the government entities are as excited as we are about getting this done. So I have a question for you, and then I have a question for those of us that did that planting project early on. That was pre-Filomena days. But the question I have for you, so in looking at what you were showing as far as the castles and the cages, so there's a group of castles that are going to be off the shoreline under the water. Then in the other area, there's going to be some cages that are also going to be under the water. Now, the castles that you were talking about, yes, those. So those are obviously, they're going to be going with the tide. So in other words, sometimes they're going to be not covered with water and sometimes they are. So is that going to affect the oysters in any way?
So, so the reef down below in
Right.
the water here, at the very lowest tide, you will just see the top of it, where it's located. So pretty much the majority of the time, these are going to be completely submerged, with some water over them. So, there should be no tidal effects, negative effects on the oysters. Although I should say oysters do survive above the tidals, above water. They'll survive just fine. So this portion is completely submerged, and just bears part of the top of it visible during extreme low tides. This wave attenuation structure here, completely visible during low tide. At high tide, it's the top part should be mostly visible, except during an extreme high tide. There's no plan to seed the upper blocks with oysters or anything else. I didn't clarify that, and I apologize. So thanks for asking. I do expect, and you can expect, that some creatures will eventually sort of grow on these structures naturally, but there's no plan to seed them.
Okay, thank you for that, because that's I was confused by that.
Yes.
And then just one other question about for any of us, anybody else that did the planting. I know that the Japanese knotweed took over that whole area, in the upper portion. But did anything we plant survive in any of the other areas? I mean, you were talking about behind the Spartina, there's what did you call those plants that you want to not pull out? What are they called?
There's Spartina, there's the patens, there's some shrubs, there's Iva, Baccharis, or two most common shrubs, the two common shrubs that you have growing here.
But we didn't, that's not from anything. Does anybody know if any of that was from what we planted, or did nothing survive that we planted?
Well, I do know that some of the there's a sumac, sumac that you planted. It looked great. It's still growing. And lucky the way you guys have been approaching the weeding, you've been doing it by hand. So you've been able to be very selective with what you're removing. It's a lot of work to do it that way, but the advantage is that you can go in and certainly anything that's growing, and there are some desirable plants kind of poking in through the weeds, you're able to selectively retain those desirable plants. So the sumac is growing. There might be something else in there too.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
No.
Thank you.
I have a question. Since you were talking about invasive and non-invasive, it was brought to my attention that there was poison ivy that was up along the fence up against the school's property, and since the kids will be moving in and out, would there be an attempt to remove the poison ivy? I know it's not invasive, it's a naturally growing plant that many of our birds in the local area depend on in the winter. So would that be removed, or would that be staying?
I know Parks' general approach to poison ivy is to remove it if it's in an area where contact is highly likely. So if it's growing on the fence, then I think that's a target for removal. If it's growing in an area where people are unlikely to be walking through, it's often okay to just leave it. It is a native plant. It does offer some food for birds, etc. While there's ecological and biological benefits to having it, we obviously don't want the kids to be touching it. So I think where it's in an area where they might be in direct contact with it, I think removal is the safer bet.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question kind of around the students as well. I know you said this, I love the pictures. First of all, it's so nice to see it kind of, with this beautiful, with your renderings of what it's going to look like. I know you also said it's like phase 1. But I was just wondering, is there like a maximum capacity of people that can be out there, bodies at this point, students? Because typically a class would be like 25, so 26 or something. So is that something that you have an idea right now?
I think the beach area could comfortably hold a class of people. I think the little entrance area, it's limited in scale, but it's intended to hold a classroom size, kids standing around. One of the reasons why we originally proposed a larger circulation system across the whole site is because we wanted to, for one reason is we wanted to kind of funnel people within a certain area. We don't want them trampling around the marsh grass or any other sensitive vegetation. And having a defined path area helps us do that. But there's also downsides to having a path. Once you put a path, you're inviting people basically to walk on that area. And so the Parks Department isn't quite ready to commit to a full circulation system on this site. So right now we're settling on a smaller area. We can kind of test it out, see how many students we can get into this area comfortably. And if we find that it's not sufficient for a classroom to comfortably gather, that could give us a good incentive to coerce parks to allowing the group to expand the circulation system in the future. So it's phase one. It's partly just kind of testing things out and seeing how this works, and I'm sure there will be shortcomings to it as well. So allow the group to see what needs to be improved, what needs to be expanded. So I guess to answer your question is, I think there is great capacity for the site to hold a classroom, but I think there's more potential. It's just phase one is going to be somewhat limited.
Oh, thank you. Just one follow-up. I see even on this picture, there's like, it looks like where that riprap is, or there's smaller sized rocks. Is that something that is going to be added so that people can go down to the beach a little bit easier? Or
you're talking about this little,
yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't mentioning that because that's sort of it's in the works and it's in discussion. We are proposing, I can go back. We're proposing to put a little path, stone path, retained stone path over the riprap. We're talking with parks about it, if they'll let us do that. It is above the tidal zone. The tide generally goes up to about this area, so it wouldn't get inundated, or there isn't risk of like the regular tides affecting it, but there is, where it's located, risk that maybe a big storm surge could come and affect that. So there's some risk with putting a little path there. And anyway, we're in conversation. We're hoping that they'll say yes, but we don't know.
Fingers crossed. Thank you.
Hi, where are we getting the seeded oysters from?
I think Kelly could probably feed you in specifics, but I think it's Cornell.
There are a few places where we can get seeded oysters from, and Cornell Extension School Cooperative Extension is one place, and then there are other places where we could get it as well. But we've been talking to Cornell, and they've been very helpful in the project.
And how many oysters would the current plan lead to, generally speaking? Because it'd be hard to count, but
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I can't give you, let me,
like a ballpark.
yeah, well, I can't give you a specifics in terms of like the number of oysters, but I can tell you, I'm looking this up. So we're doing in the sort of reef, just in the reef, I'm not talking about the wave attenuation. So just down here, 84 oyster castle units, so 23 linear feet, 44 square feet measured at the base. So not counting the different layers. That's the volume of the reef. So, you know, I can't anticipate what the density of the oyster growth is going to be, but that gives you a sense of the scale of it. Hopefully, yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah.
I think Janie has a question.
Yeah, my question is also in regards to the plantings that we had done previously. It was my understanding that a lot of the plants we put in there were self-seeding and spreading. And an example that I remember is the goldenrod. So I'm wondering if we could go out there as a group at some particular time, maybe end of May or June, when all of these will start seeding, like making plants again, and go through an identification routine where we're able to decide like what things to keep and move or propagate, and what things that are weeds, as far as identifying what happened from before. Because from our plantings, if anything survived, it should have spread seeds.
It's a great idea, Janie. We should definitely do that. And in fact, there's more goldenrod. The goldenrod did take by the riprap.
Okay.
There's more goldenrod, and almost all of the sumacs that we planted in that sort of northern peninsula, they all survived.
Okay,
And they're
and
doing
the,
well.
by the fence,
By
by the
fence-
fence, we had put bigger plants like bush, like, and I don't remember all the names that we went in with, but there
Maybe
was,
yes, they're those by that by the gate to the left near the fence.
right,
Those,
right.
those bushes survived. And maybe
Okay.
they're bayberry bushes, they're little bushes.
Yeah. Okay, good, good. So I think that we might find some surprises out there.
Yeah,
Sounds very
great idea.
positive.
Great idea to get in there this spring, and we should identify them. Are there any other questions, or does that wrap it up, basically? I think so. Filomena, thank you again for your time this evening. You brought the Living Shoreline to life. It was great to see all the visuals. It's so promising. And exciting to see the progress that has been made. Many City Islanders have worked very hard back there for, going back to project idea 15, 20 years ago. So there's a great love of that little tiny piece of property. And it will bring a lot of enjoyment to many people and to the school children at PS 175 and to other schools in the Bronx. So thank you for explaining the work that's being done there.
Yes, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Right.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Good job, Sally.
Thank you. I'm so tired. This is very late for me.
Me too. Good night.
Good night.